All right, so today we will go into the question of how various governmental or non-governmental institutions try to interfere in the mobility of individuals. And this can be done in multiple ways, with multiple strength, and with all kinds of success. And we will address that by discussing the various perspectives that will be shared by by today's speakers. So first, I would like to introduce Jean-Louis de Brouwer. He will be our first speaker. He is currently the director of the European Affairs Program at the Egmont Institute in Brussels. Before he had this position, he was involved with the European Commission as a director and responsible for all sorts of policies related to immigration, asylum, visas, and border policies. Furthermore, he is involved in various universities, both in and outside of Belgium. And we're very happy that he is here today, and I would like to invite him to give his presentation. So Jean-Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me tonight. I hope to be up to the challenge, but I'm very happy also to reconnect with the Metropolis network, because I remember vividly having been involved in the early days of this network, in my own personal early days in the migration policy area in the European Commission. So it's not back to the future, but something like that. I would say that by way of introduction, a reference document that we should bear in mind before discussing what we are going to discuss tonight is a groundbreaking report that was published at the end of last year, and I shared it with you, Jan, you will remember. It's the first ever IOM African Union report on African migration. And the subtitle of this report tells a lot. It was about changing the narratives. Because European policy towards migration, EU policy towards migration is largely built upon narratives. When looking at Africa, 10 years ago, a few years ago, I would say, Africa could be seen as a continent in transition, a continent of opportunities, provided that the right answers were given to the challenges of education, corruption, and economic diversification. However, that was not enough to counteract alarmist representation of an African mass exodus fueled by the media and some policymakers alike. Where there are still many to come, according to the title of a paper released by the European Commission Joint Research Center in 2018, a paper I will refer to later in my presentation, if I manage to stay within the 10 minutes deadline that you allocated to each of us. Of course, there were different, more documented views advocating for a grown-up understanding of sub-Saharan Africa, considering the diverse consequences of EU policies towards Africa, including climate change policies, and paying attention more to the distribution than to the pace of Africa's economic growth. In the meanwhile, findings were piling up concerning the complex nature of African migration, its multiple drivers, the fact that African migration to Europe is best understood as a continuation of intra-African migration, and the pivotal role of urban nodes in intra as well as extra-continental migration. And then, as the Dean of the American University reminded us all, and then came COVID-19. Was it the crisis too much? No doubt a crisis with multiple impact, hitting hard autocratic regimes, broken public service, fragile communities, and still to be consolidated economies. And we are still confronted with more questions than answers. As stated by this African Union IOM report. Is this brave endeavor to try to change the narrative still on track? The EU has proposed a comprehensive strategy not for Africa, but with Africa. And I will come back on that later also in my presentation. Are its fundamentals still valid? Noting also that the EU-AU summit has been postponed time and again. Can EU member states, which have for historical, while questionable reasons, ties with Africa, play yet a positive role of bridge builders in the framework of the so-called Team Europe approach? And last but not least, I mean, is there any way for Europe to work with Africa about, to work with Africa amid the global scramble for vaccine? This is, I would say, basically the background on which our exchange of view should take place tonight. Now, as it is about governance, a quick word about the history, the very recent history of the EU approach of migration, at least the external dimension of its policies. The very notion of partnership with countries of origin, partnership with countries of origin and transit was there from the very early days, from the beginning of the development of this agenda. For those who know a little bit about the prehistory of the EU integration, I'm referring here to the famous Tampere program adopted under Finnish presidency just at the eve, just at turn of the millennium. But unfortunately, the first show of this willingness to build bridges and establish partnership with countries of origin and transit was the offer to negotiate with them readmission agreement. Readmission agreement, you all know what it is, as you are all experts. It's about agreeing with a third country that it will take back its own nationals who are staying irregularly in the countries, in receiving countries. But the EU was bold enough to ask to the partners, between inverted comma, to whom this readmission agreement were offered or were extended, not only to take back their own nationals, but also, which is, by the way, an international public law obligation, but also to take back third country national who had transited through their territories before reaching the Union. That was, of course, not the best possible way to build confidence, to build trust in view of establishing a partnership. And the EU is still suffering years after from this initial sin. There were further steps taken, and I will not bother you with these steps. First, the first brave endeavor, again, of the EU was to propose the development of a global approach. What was the global approach? That was an agenda which was supposed to be balanced and built around three series of issues: legal migration on one hand, irregular migration on the other end, and the synergies between migration and development policies. That failed. Basically, that failed. Why? Because the EU could not refrain from attaching more importance to its priority, i.e. managing irregular migration, than to listen to what the concerns could be of the supposedly partner countries. Then the next step was a somewhat sophisticated, more sophisticated approach of this initial endeavor. I mean, called this time the global approach on migration and mobility, dealing not only with migration issues and the nexus between migration and development, but also with protection issues and mobility, i.e. visa policies. In the meanwhile, there was a step change in the construction of the EU migration, external dimension of the migration policy. That was that at last the EU managed to integrate fully in its external relation priority and apparatus migration-related concerns, which were until now a little bit alien to the mainstream agenda of the EU. The problem is that this integration was so well performed that at the end, we ended up with completely upside down agenda, which were either with regional entities or with individual countries completely and wrongly dominated by migration-related concerns. And of course, this was epitomized at the occasion of the so-called refugee crisis, which broke out in 2015-2016, around, as a consequence of the crisis in the civil war in Syria and around the eastern flank of the EU. There were at the time a flurry of initiative. There was the Valletta Summit. There was also the EU-Africa Trust Fund, which was also deemed to support project aiming at better controlling migration in Africa and within African countries. There was also the famous or infamous EU-Turkey statement, with I think the biggest ever financial instrument of the EU dedicated to migration-related issues, the Facility for Refugee in Turkey, which allowed the EU to spend 2 times 3 billion euro in view of supporting the reception of Syrian asylum seekers in Turkey. But in all these cases, what strikes me after all these years is that, and it's very visible when you look at what the main indicators the main indicator of success of its strategy for the EU and its member states, i.e. the lowering of the migration pressure, and also the lowering of the number of people dead at sea while trying to cross the Mediterranean and enter irregularly, between inverted commas, the EU. This policy was built upon a containment concern. Some would say it was the securitization of migration-related issue. Yes, okay, but it was mainly a policy of containment, an obsession for the containment of migration. And also, when you see what is happening these days, you see that there is a kind of in the way EU is approaching migration-related issue. That is to say, EU cannot make it internally when the EU is, blocked by some very difficult issues to be negotiated between member states. There is a tendency to take the internal heat off while turning to third countries and the relation with third countries. That is exactly what is happening nowadays. When you see the ongoing semestrial presidency of the EU, i.e. Portugal, which is indeed dealing with very difficult internal files concerning the balance between solidarity and responsibility in sharing the protection responsibility between member states, escaping these difficulties by wishing to reinvigorate the relation with third countries. But okay, this is totally counterintuitive because, okay, everybody knows that you are strong outside only when you make it inside. Why is the EU such a strong trade power worldwide? Because it has been able to build one of the largest, if not the biggest, internal market in the world. So don't expect to perform well in terms of, developing a balanced relation with third countries in handling migration and migration flow if yourself you are not able to put your own house in order. Now, what matters? What are the facts? Of course, and it was referred to in the introduction. Everybody is now watching the consequences of the pandemic. 20 months when the pandemic actually broke out, there were a lot of concerns about its damning impact on the health situation in African countries. Until now, they did not materialize in as dramatic way as some had foreseen by the time. But what is more of a concern are the economic and social consequences of the pandemic on, as I said in my introduction, very, very, very weak and unstable economies, and also in countries where public service were already in a very bad and in a very poor shape. Now the question is, when indeed mobility will be restored when border controls will be alleviated, not only inside the global north, but also inside the global south? Can we expect increased migration flow? Can we express it, to use the EU language, increased migration pressure from Africa towards EU? I think that no one can foresee. I mean, strategic forecast and forecast in general is a very difficult exercise in the present circumstances. But clearly, the terms of reference, the right terms of references to deal with these issues between the EU and Africa in an adult way, the right terms of references are not there. Not even this new strategy or renewed strategy, partnership strategy, not again for Africa, but with Africa. We can expand about this later on during our debate and questions and answer, because I think that I'm now reaching the end of my 10 minutes. But even that, is still to be balanced. And as I said also, we are still waiting for the EU-AU summit to take place. It has been postponed time and again. It might happen before the end of the year, but certainly in the not in the best possible circumstances. Jan, I would have loved to elaborate further also on, a certain number of myths about what the African migration is actually and the way it is seen by the European, but I could come back on that later during our Q&A session. Thanks a lot, and over to my colleagues panelists.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, which is very interesting, but also very, very gloomy. So you've argued that it's important that Europe, the European Union, plays a powerful role, but that their capacity to do that is interrupted by all sorts of internal problems. And so since they cannot solve their position internally with regard to migration, it means that it's much more difficult to be a strong partner for countries in Africa to play a very important role. I agree with you that predicting is not the best thing we can do. Economists try to predict, but they're not always very successful, and I think that we should stay away from that. On the other hand, the prospects seem to be very complicated. Final point that you underlined was the contradiction between, say, the written intentions, or at least the lip services that were paid to collaboration, partnership on the one hand, and the rather one-sided approach with regard to irregular migration on the other hand. So I'm sure there's several questions that emerge out of it, but we'll come back to that later. Let's first give the floor to Linda Oucho. She's with the African Migration and Development Policy Center in Nairobi in Kenya. She was a migrant herself for 16 years, and she spent time in Ghana, Botswana, and the United Kingdom. In the UK, she was, amongst other things, at Warwick University, where she obtained a PhD degree in ethnic relations. After returning to Kenya, she became active in all sorts of ways in the world of advice and consultancy. She's being consulted to a host of international agencies, including IOM, ICMPD, AUC, UNDP, GIZ, IDRC, and FES. I have to confess that I'm not entirely sure that I know what all these acronyms stand for, but I'm very happy that Linda Oucho is here with us. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan, for the introduction. There are many acronyms. I thought it was easy just to state them like that, but thank you so much for giving me time to give my intervention on this. I'll just share my PowerPoint. Just give me 1 second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you for giving me time to speak on this topic. And I was quite intrigued by the topic about making of a responsible migrant. And I kept on thinking, what does that mean in reality, either in policy and practice? So I had to look at it from a different lens. where I had to look at the picture we're looking at in terms of mixed migration, especially to Europe. And I'm sure this one is an image that everybody sees and knows about migration within Africa and to other regions. And obviously the primary corridors are the Northern Corridor from the Horn of Africa via Ethiopia, South Sudan, and also the Western Corridor from West Africa. And you find a lot of these pathways are irregular migrants using former trading routes to access Europe. So I won't go into the details of that, maybe to buy a bit of time for the question and answer. And I just wanted to highlight a few things regarding the coordination of governance at the time, to talk about how it was prior to the SDGs of 2015. Prior to that, the discussions were very unstructured on migration governance. Different actors in terms of ministries and departments were dealing with migration issues from different angles, but they were not speaking to one another. So there was no centralized platform on that aspect. So in order for us to talk about this idea of having discussions on safe, orderly, regular pathways of migration between Africa and Europe, we need to know whether our house is in order, whether people in the countries of origin are actually having this conversation, even transit countries and even destination countries. And one thing I also noticed is that African countries were at different stages of developing either their national migration policy or their national labor migration policies. And if you look at it now, I don't think there's actual documentation that explains who has a policy to manage migration in general or labor migration specifically. But it's a process that's ongoing, which I'll come to later. Some of them are also not aware of their migration profile. So in order for you to know what kind of migrant you'd want, the kind of environment that a migrant can, pathway that a migrant can take, you need to know your migration profiles. And a lot of countries did not even know their migration profiles. They knew the usual immigrants and diaspora and refugees. But when you talk about labor migration, there were selected studies and not so detailed to a certain extent in some countries where there was actually very limited information on that. And we found that most of the studies were focused on economic contributions and security. I think this was actually alluded to by the first panelist. When we look at it from 2015, and the SDGs, migration was included as one of the SDGs, we found that there was now an interest on migration issues by different stakeholders, from funders to governments to even CSOs, and CSOs were already interested in that, but so they were pushing the agenda, but it was more like everybody was coming to the table to discuss migration issues. So what I noted, and I've just pointed out in my next slide, the different agencies that actually now were now having targeted activities on migration. So one of them was the EU. When I look at my region, the Horn of Africa region and East Africa, they were funding more initiatives that were looking at the root causes of migration in the Horn of Africa. And this actually brought a debate among different stakeholders, because I think the drivers or the root causes are actually known. So it's not that we don't know about them, we just have to find ways or solutions and mechanisms to address some of these root causes. And also just to keep in mind that these root causes are quite deeply rooted and historical. So it's almost like you're changing a migration behavior. Then there's also the GIZ program, which is co-funded by EU on the better migration management in the Horn of Africa, that is promoting safe, orderly, and regular migration within the region, within and from the region. And also just to point out, IOM has a joint initiative with the ILO African Union, ECA, on the Joint Labor Migration Program, which is meant to strengthen labor migration governance in selected regions and member states. And also AU has been at the forefront in terms of formulating or supporting countries to formulate national migration policies and also regional migration policies. And this is just something that these are just some of the ongoing discussions, so not all of them. Because of the interest of time, I just selected these 4. So I wanted to focus more on the impact of these interventions. They have actually created awareness on some of the migration profiles. What I found very useful with IOM were the migration profiles that they were given, because a lot of the countries did not know who their migrants were, either internally, regionally, or they didn't have the details and the data. And this created awareness of where the gaps are and where the needs are in terms of knowledge, policy, and resources. It also facilitated discussions on legal pathways on migration to take place. So looking at migration policy framework for Africa that was recently revised in 2018, and the Global Compact for Migration. And this at least allowed them to know what is their profile, what are the issues that they're looking legal pathways they need to create to protect their migrants, especially those who are adopting irregular pathways, using irregular pathways. But it also created a platform where state and non-state actors discuss migration issues affecting the country and the region. And this is quite important because as a think tank, we were not having access to that space. We were speaking to that space and speaking to different actors, but it was to have a coordinated space where we could actually talk to them about the issues that are arising based on migration and how they can address it in terms of the different strategies. And that's where we saw that there was this there were different ministries and departments that were doing the same activities, but they were not speaking to one another. A case in point is Ministry of Labor will be facilitating migration of migrants to the Gulf states, but they were not, but the consular service come in when there are issues concerning maybe a stranded labor migrant in the Gulf state. So we saw overlapping activities, but the ministries were not speaking to each other. And I thought this was important for some of these interventions that happened. But with all these interventions and these impacts, I came across a few challenges, and I would like to pose them as questions that we can think about. And my question was always about ownership. How are African governments owning this process, especially when you're looking at migration to Europe or to other regions? Are they leading the agenda, and what aspect of it are they bringing to the table that actually considers those migrants? And that brings that question about what does a responsible migrant look like for them as government officials, as government representatives? And do these discussions respond to the migration needs of the source and destination countries? And maybe I should have added even transit countries, because if different migrants are using different pathways to access different destinations, the conversation needs to look at the connections between the countries. And that's where the regional economic communities come in terms of having a solution or a strategy to respond to these needs. And then in terms of implementation, and I know everybody knows this in different contexts, implementation is always a challenge. So where and how are the resources sourced from in terms of human and technology? And at this day and age, I think the pandemic has proven that the need for technology to come to the forefront. And this is also just based on social dialogue platforms, even just mapping out who's going from where. It's lacking in different countries, and you have to look at infrastructural development and infrastructural development such as electricity in certain countries, which may be lacking. And is it a question of budgeting? Because I have not come across any country that is sufficiently doing a migration budgeting system. So budgeting for their actual migration activities at a national level that will be now implemented. So what needs to be done to go from there? And how do governments actually plan to decentralize the process? We always look at policy at the national level, but we forget that migrants are coming from rural, urban, peri-urban areas. How much of these decentralized counties, communities, provinces actually know about their migration? And in my experience, many of them know very limited information aside from diaspora or immigrants that are coming to the country, but they don't even see themselves as labor migrants in other countries. It's some form of knowledge exchange and understanding. So how do we decentralize the implementation process, and who should be involved? And how can migrants be included in the process? Because we're doing policies and interventions related to migrants, but are we involving them in the process? And finally, a question about sustainability. And I'm sure this question always comes up with different aspects and different situations, but how do governments ensure sustainability of the process? So once a new government comes in place, will they take the same agenda, improve on some of the gaps and limitations, and take it forward from there? Will there be more actors included to the table? And this could include CSOs and different faith-based organizations that actually have access and interact with these migrants that are moving from different places. And what else, is needed to manage, coordinate, handle migration matters? Because I think we are looking at it in terms of creating a foundation of how we should be handling migration, but I think we need to think also ahead as to what is missing in this actual foundation. It's something that's an ongoing process, but these are some of the questions I would pose to the audience that we can actually have a discussion. And this goes back to the original statement that was made. How do we find solutions to actually some of the challenges that we face in terms of migration? So with that, I end up my intervention and I pass it over to you, Jan, and I hope I've actually bought you a bit of time for discussion. So thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. What you basically point at is that after a period in which there actually was a lot of ignorance, lack of understanding what was happening in the world of migration, apparently there have been all sorts of initiatives that led to a greater awareness and at least a location, a place where people could exchange all sorts of issues. That being said, there's still all sorts of questions to be addressed, and you pointed to 3 types of questions. One related to ownership, so who owns the process, whose interests are at stake. Furthermore, you pointed to the implementation of these issues, notably the presence or absence of resources. And finally, there's the point of sustainability. It's important that if something works or could work, it should be able to work in the longer run, rather than just one time. And finally, you welcome everybody to engage with you in a discussion, and I hope that everybody is interested and eager to accept that invitation. If you have any point of comment or question or idea, please enter your notes in the chat box, which is sort of here at the bottom of your screen. And now we give the floor to our final speaker, Dr. Irian Fremantle, who is an associate researcher with the African Center for Migration and Society in the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. She holds a Bachelor in Media and Cultural Studies from the University of Düsseldorf and a Master in Migration and Ethnic Studies from the University of Amsterdam, and a PhD in Migration Studies from the University of Witwatersrand. And ever since she entered this field, she has done research revolving around migration, xenophobia, and social cohesion, notably in South Africa. So without further ado, Irian, you're welcome to give your presentation.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Jan, so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone, and thank you for having me. The other 2 speakers have been so good at keeping to the time limit, so I'm going to try my very best to meet those high standards. I'm going to share my presentation now. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can.
You can see the screen. All right. Okay, so let me jump straight in. So thanks to the other 2 speakers. Of course, we already know that European governments, often in collaboration with African partners, with African governments, but also other African partners, are spending a lot of time and money and attention on keeping African migration at bay. And, they're doing a whole lot of things, ranging from training border officials in Mali to awareness raising campaigns to sending unmanned drones over the Mediterranean to intercept boats. But I think that, in all types of activities, and, to pick up Jean-Louis' term of, this obsession with containing migration, there is a sort of underlying enabling, legitimizing discourse that gives meaning to all of these very different kinds of activities. And I think that, at the core of this kind of enabling framework is this recoding of exclusion as a form of protection. To say it differently, that, keeping Africans out of Europe is not because Europe doesn't like Africans or because they just don't want them there. But it is actually better for Africans themselves and for the continent as a whole if they stay there, and that Africa really can only prosper and thrive if people stay in their own countries. It is perhaps nowhere more overtly visible than in these activities that fall under this under the banner of raising awareness about the dangers of irregular migration. So I'm going to speak a little bit about those kinds of campaigns in this presentation. So lots of different actors do this kind of awareness raising. The IOM is certainly one of the most prominent ones, but Western European governments are also having their own websites where they inform about the risks of migration, etc. But the IOM is a particularly prominent actor. And they do a whole lot of different types of, they raise awareness, let's say they raise awareness in a whole lot of different formats. There are videos, there's music, there are poems, there are information campaigns, events. They also really like to put the message on a t-shirt. As you can see in those photos, I'm not sure you can read it, but it reads something like, there is no place like home, my future is here, migration is good, but do it in the right way, etc. So these messages come in all sorts of different formats, but I would say that they all, they certainly follow a kind of formula. No matter what the actual format is, they follow a formula. And the formula has sort of two aspects to it. The one aspect is this awareness raising and educating about the dangers of the journey. And not just about the dangers of the journey ahead, but also of the futility of it. There's a lot of emphasis on making it obvious that the migration journey or project is unlikely to be successful, that migrants will get hurt, that they probably lose their lives. And even if they were to make it through, they will still, they will not achieve their dreams. Their aspirations will probably not be met when they make it through to the other side. So that is the one side. The other side is this aspect of return, on emphasizing the importance of return, or actually also the importance of immobility, of not actually leaving in the first place. And then also about opportunities at home. So there is this notion that basically if people just really commit to being at home and to sort of change their mindset and work really hard, then there's lots of opportunities right at their doorstep. And on the left, these pictures that you see of this young man, it's a still from a video of an IOM video. He started a poultry business after he didn't make it to Europe, and now he's back in his country, and he says, I can say that everything I was looking for abroad by the grace of God and with the support of IOM, I can have it here. So this is a very typical, it's a very typical narrative about the sort of return and the opportunity that is at home. And I think just as formulaic as the awareness raising narrative is and what is focused on, as formulaic is also what is not spoken about. And I think that's very important, these sort of omissions in those narratives. So for example, what doesn't feature at all in these stories of migrants that get told to raise awareness is that it's a sort of political and legal context, both historical and current. There is no reference, let alone criticism of European immigration policies in there. There is no reference to Europe's historical role in contributing, in many ways causing, the kinds of conditions that make people seek livelihoods elsewhere, or in determining the bad conditions under which people move. There is no criticism of agencies like Frontex. If there is ever any kind of bad guy in there mentioned, then it's probably the Libyans. The other omission that is very glaring actually is that they're obviously in those narratives never the voices of those who made it. These are stories of failed migrants, of returned migrants who have come to regret their decision. These are not stories of migrants who somehow made it through all the hardships and arrived and have made it to the other side, so to speak. Next slide. So we've had the t-shirts. Another emphasis in these narratives is this emphasis on ignorance. So migration, or irregular migration, I must say, unsafe migration in that narrative is pretty much, a mistake that should not be repeated. So the people who come home, the returnees, they spread the message that they have made a mistake by moving without knowing enough about the journey, without knowing what awaits them on the other side. And they want to spread the message to their peers as well, so that people don't make the same mistake that they have in the first place. But then if you look a little bit further, there is more to it than just sort of providing information so that people don't make mistakes in these campaigns. There is very much a sort of form of moral policing at play as well. And I think this is, of course, highly problematic, where it's basically said that migration is not an individual choice. It's something that causes harm all around at a whole other level than just the migrant themselves. That yes, the migrant might lose their life or be disappointed in the expectations that they had of the journey. But this harms everyone. Moving irregularly harms the migrants, it harms their families. There are stories of heartbroken mothers who don't know where their children are. It harms their communities. It deprives their countries of origin of labor and skills and talent. And given that, that in this official European African partnership, that there's often this talk of, we can only thrive, all of us together. So Europe cannot thrive if Africa doesn't thrive. And, if we take it one step down, then if Africa cannot thrive, if its people are leaving, then basically you render every time someone steps onto that boat to Libya, you render that a sort of act of imperiling, of endangering a global future for everyone. So it adds a whole lot of reverberations and impact on that one decision of this person. And in a way, this sort of betrayal of country and community basically just creates people as sort of irresponsible. So it's not just about them not knowing what they're getting into. It's also that what they're doing is irresponsible, what they're doing is immoral. It's much more than just being unaware of what's happening. So this basically turns staying at home as a sort of duty to build self and country, and anything else is, I would say, a sort of a selfish shortcut. You're betraying, you're leaving things behind, you're not willing to work hard at home. So there's very much this sort of moral policing at home, very much the sort of form of moral policing at play. And I'm not sure if you had time while I was talking to look at these kinds of quotes here at the bottom of the slide, but the one that is one of my favorites is from Günther Noke, who's the German Chancellor's personal representative for Africa, sometimes also called the German Africa Commissioner. And he says, you can't have a lifestyle as we have in Europe without working like Europe. There's no legal right to a good life anywhere in this world. For this, Africans have to work hard as well. And these other two quotes sort of go sort of along a similar line. So to wrap up, I'm aware of time. So the last point I want to speak about is the continuities that we definitely see in these kinds of awareness-raising campaigns with long-standing colonial and deeply racist discourses. This idea that Europeans basically have to save Africans from themselves, from their own ignorance, from their own rational impulses, as is this idea that agency gets recoded into ignorance or deviance, so that the decision to move becomes not just something that people decide for themselves, that they have chosen to do on the basis of their own analysis of costs and benefits, but it becomes something that they either do because they just don't know better or because they deliberately want to break the rules, and hence require some sort of control to contain this. or to alleviate it. This idea that Europe has to be cruel to be kind, that effectively even the most coercive measures of excluding African migrants are somehow justified because it's ultimately in Africa's own interest, because if they leave, they cannot thrive and their continent cannot thrive. That also has a long continuity. And of course, the upshot of it for Europe, of course, is as well that, this is how I come back to the opening of my presentation, by recoding exclusion into this form of protection, Europe is able to address this dilemma that it has, which is to be violent, to exclude violently, and at the same time protecting its own self-image of being a champion of human rights and committed to global progress. Because they're doing it for Africa's own good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Iria. In your interesting presentation, you actually unpack the idea of the responsible migrant, the individual who takes responsibility, who chooses the moral high, and in so doing collaborates. And at the same time, there are these sort of political structures, notably coming from the EU, that in a way argue that what people do when they migrate is exactly the opposite. So they don't act in a responsible way, and they are on they have entered a sort of a dead-end street. And I would like to take that as a starting point for the questions. Oh, by the way, anybody who has questions, please ask them or raise your points, put them in the chat box. And but the question that I want to ask now is actually sort of relevant for all three speakers. So if you would take the idea of the responsible immigrant as a starting point, you could argue that this is by appreciating the agency of the migrants themselves. So people choose their own path in life, which interestingly sort of coincide with sort of a neoliberal logic that seemed to prevail in Europe. Jean-Louis has argued that in Europe, it's important to not just sort of follow their own logic, but that Europeans should understand the individual pathways that people have developed or that emerge in Africa, and that in so doing, they're better able to deal with that. And Linda has also pointed to sort of that those connections. So what I actually want to know is what is the alternative for sort of seeing immigrants as people who should appreciate their own morality and who should act in a responsible way without telling them what they should do? I'm not sure I make my point very clear, but there seems to be a contradiction between the willingness to sort of understand what the others are doing, and at the same time, by allocating responsibility, etc., to the migrating individual, Irian argues, well, but that's a way of excluding. It's sort of a going back to an old way of excluding the others. So I would like to invite the three of you to briefly comment upon it, but only in a few minutes, so that there's space for the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, can I start, Jan?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. I mean, you're asking a big questions, we're talking about a system of inequality, of which migration is one aspect. We could talk about other areas, we could talk about trade, we could talk about all sorts of areas. So I can't answer that question, but I think as a very general framework, it's not about telling people how they should be. It's about actually creating the conditions for people to make real choices. So yes, I don't think anybody should be forced out of their home country because of war or because there is no food. And people, yes, they have a right to stay if they want to, which is also a narrative that has been sort of spun in the European line of thinking. But it's about really creating choices of people, enabling people to say, I want to leave, I want to stay. Both of it holds a future for me, I think. So, yeah.
Okay. Linda, please.
Yes, I think I'll just expand on Arian's point, and I just think about what I had initially presented on looking at the migrants themselves. They are not from cities, and when you think of the source of this, where they come from, and the information that they get for destinations, it's not a government official or a website. So if you want them to act responsibility and have some sort of morality in terms of their migration, you need to look at those information channels that they actually get, the network that they use to actually migrate. Because myself, I would go through the formal channels and know what it means to be a responsible migrant. But then if my environment is conducive, I have that choice not to leave or not to leave or to stay. But if someone is in a position where they're economically challenged, they're having insecurity, and they know that their family is in a country that is considered safe by their interpretation, then they'll make that decision based on a safe selection of that safe country. So I think in terms of saying that asking the migrant to act responsibly is quite difficult, because also that profile changes from time to time. So that will be just my quick intervention. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you. Jean-Louis?
Yes, I must say I don't feel utterly comfortable with that question. Just a few comments. First of all, okay, myself, I've elaborated a lot about EU policies, but we should try, mostly in the framework of Metropolis, to take, a broader scope and look at the big picture, because I think that many of the statements that were shared this afternoon, many of the questions that were put to us this afternoon, including Linda's question, could also be put in other framework, in other geographical framework. It can. They are transversal issues, which matters also when dealing with the south-north migration on the American continent, when dealing with, for instance, a largely ignored displacement phenomenon, which is yet the second largest one in the world, which is the caseload of the Venezuelan refugees or displaced person in Latin America. So, these are questions which are not limited to the EU-Africa framework. My second point, and I was really very interested by Irian, I hope that I pronounced your name correctly, presentation, is that I'm really sorry, no, I was going to use a very slang expression. The way to deal with migration as a pathology really gets on my nerves. It's really the basic of it. Moving is a very human behavior. Human beings have been moving since prehistory. Migration is not a pathology. And my third comment would be to say that indeed what EU decision-making powers are badly lacking, but maybe they would not even want to look at them, is qualitative studies about migration, not quantitative figures, but qualitative studies. Listening to the narratives of the migrants. Getting their stories, trying to better understand why they took the decision to move. And I would still have a fourth comment. I think that the notion of responsibility has indeed a lot to do with, okay, do you have the freedom of choice? Do you have the freedom of choice? That's the reason why, for instance, I have a problem with, people do usually say, no, but okay, smuggling, there, you know the difference between the two legal terms, smuggling and trafficking. The people who are trafficked are victims, and the people who are smuggled are in a way complice of those who are smuggling them. Wrong. People are using smugglers because they had to flee. They had there are statistics, again, I'm referring to numbers and not individuals, that more than 90% of people who are trying to enter irregularly in the EU have been paying smugglers. So they had no choice than to do that. So, who are we, and how to assess their responsibility? Who are we to assess their ethical behavior? They are simply confronted with circumstances which are way beyond their control, and they try to cope with these circumstances. They try to cope in a very brave way and in a very hazardous way also. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a sort of a question that I pick up from what has come in, that sort of follows up here. So if we take, say, the European view, for as far as it's justified to talk about the European view as a starting point, then what would be their measure of success? You could argue that apparently Europe has been able to organize agreements with other nation states, with other governments, and those governments within Africa, they to some extent adopt the way of doing of Europe. So how would you see that? So the role of national governments in the international context herein. Maybe I'll start in reverse order. So Jean-Louis, if you would like to say something about it, then I go back to Irian, to Linda and Irian.
Well, I mean, I really appreciated Linda's presentation because, I mean, that was in the too many webinars and conferences that I attended, the first interlocutor who actually set the ball in the court of the African government. Because, of course, I mean, a lot can be said about the way the EU is most probably, in my own modest opinion, not approaching migration-related issue on the right way, but it takes two to tango. It takes two to tango. And okay, the EU is patronizing for sure, but it's all the more easy for the EU to patronizing that very often the interlocutors in front of the EU are not ready and are not getting their act together in view of engaging into a grown-up dialogue with the EU. There are structural inequalities, and I mean again, Ariane referred to them clearly. I mean, building the partnership is always very difficult when the two partners are not on an equal footing. That is for sure. But certainly, I mean, challenging government in countries of origin, I will not say African governments, but challenging government in countries of origin about the way they approach this human reality, which is the emigration of part of their population. Emigration of part of their population is, of course, a key to try to build something more solid than what we are witnessing in all different parts of the world as of now. I hope that I answered your question.
Thanks. Linda, please. Your name was already mentioned.
Okay. I hope I understood your question right, because the network broke up for a bit. But I think what I'll focus on is at the moment when you look at the way governments, national governments, I'll talk about it from the context of Africa because that's what I know. They are still trying to understand their migration profiles and information and how to do migration governance. And sometimes you find that their bargaining and negotiating power is weakened based on maybe existing agreements that they have on trade or other aspects. So it means that they may come to the table and not understand everything that they're negotiating for their migrants. And it'll make it difficult for them to actually get a fair, get something that's proper that protects their migrants in general. So I think in that sense, when I was saying that that question on ownership, I was wondering who owns that process, because I've been in certain discussions where I feel like sometimes they feel like they're being guided as opposed to them owning the process. And I think that once they own the process, then the policy or the way they interact or the way they do migration governance will be actually more effective, because they'll know what they have to do from the beginning until the end. But I hope that answers your question, because I got a bit of the question towards the end.
Irian? You're still on mute.
There we go. Yeah, I mean that question of African collaboration, I'm thinking about that a lot, and I think it's a puzzling and it's a complex thing, and one that we actually don't have all that much research on. You know, that part of the tango, so to speak. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, African governments have incentives to let people move. We know the reasons. It's exporting unemployment. It is, the dissent that could arise from that. They certainly don't have much interest in sort of containing citizens from other countries there rather than letting them go on to Europe. On the other hand, there are, economic incentives. There's aid. There is, and that aid is increasingly being conditional on migration management, on containing people. And then I think it's also important not to conflate sort of different actors within Africa, of course. I mean, even talking about the African government, but I think one of the obvious conflations is that African governments are not the same people as low-skilled migrants who want to move. And we've even seen clashes between those two actors. We've seen backlash from returned migrants about these kind of agreements that Jean-Louis was speaking about earlier, about taking nationals back, that governments had made with European countries, that the people who had been returned were not at all thrilled about. So I think there's I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very interesting and very important area to look at, that we don't actually really understand all that much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I need to mind the time. So there's one final question that emerged, that several of you have indicated that there is a need for more research, for more data, so that we are able to really understand what's going on. And that's obvious. I'm a researcher myself, and so we're in the game of understanding, and we want more and more and more. But there is a risk. So who's going to pay for it? So the ones who pay for those projects, they can steer the type of questions. And secondly, considering that many legal opportunities to migrate no longer exist, so that the ones who move do that in their own way, undocumented or whatever. And isn't there a risk that by collecting more data, that you sort of confirm the idea of the image of the irresponsible migrant, of the one who is just violating rules or regulations, et cetera, and that would legitimize further stronger interventions. Oh, by the way, you've noticed that I like to prefer very provocative questions, and this is another one. So, Linda, would you mind starting? Linda, maybe later. Irian, would you mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, hold on. Am I still on loud? Yeah. That question that you're raising about knowledge production is obviously hugely political and fraught in so many ways. I mean, what kind of knowledge gets commissioned? Who wants to know and why? And I was thinking about that actually during Linda's presentation. And I thought, even just, we should all be very wary, I think, about just accepting, I mean, even just that question, why do we have to manage migration? I think we need to step back to that and ask, well, and what does management mean, And Jean-Louis has spoken about that it is often actually about containing, it's not about managing it. And before just sort of stepping ahead and getting ahead of ourselves and asking questions about how can we implement this and who owns this process, I think it's important to see that this is not the sort of neutral technocratic framework that it claims to be. This is, if we developing migration profiles, these are not profiles written to plan service provision or make sure there's enough schools for all the immigrant children. These are profiles written to understand who is where. These are profiles written with control in mind. And I think it's very important that we don't just adopt these concepts because, as I said, knowledge production is highly political. And the kind of research that gets money and the kind of research that doesn't, I think we can see that at the moment very much. Yeah. All
right, thanks. Linda, would you mind going into this?
Yes, I was just asking you to repeat the question because I got disconnected for a short bit.
So you were one of the speakers who addressed the lack of information, the lack of data. So that's a call for more research, but who's going to pay for that research? Who can control the questions? And what will be the possible outcome? And the question is, isn't there a risk that new research will just confirm the image of the opportunistic migrant, and that will be used as an excuse for further measures to control that.
That's a very interesting question, because at present we're doing something on knowledge ecosystems and how knowledge is produced to inform policy and how much of it becomes policy. And I always find that it's the knowledge producers are actually the migrants themselves, but is it that their information is lost in translation in that process? Because as researchers, we also look at it from a biased lens, and we actually are informed by what we know and what is guided by us. So do we also dilute the kind of information that they give us to now present it to policymakers? Now, when it comes to funding, that one, it's when you look at the sources of the countries, like in Kenya, funding, conducting research is quite an expensive venture, because it's not something that you can just pick up and go. And also the process has become more stricter in the sense that you have to have certain documents in place to actually do that. But also it's a question of, once you do get that information, are you the one who's guiding that process? Because my experience has been that you actually are going to the information, going to the field to get the information, but the funder determines what kind of results that they want to get. So if your funding is external, maybe there's a certain question they want to answer, and even if you try and control the direction that happens, it may not happen. So I think it's a question of whether there's freedom to actually state what actually exists in place, and whether funders are willing and able, or even the coordinators are willing and able to accept an argument that is different from what they know. And if it turns out, for example, as what you said, the results actually just confirm that, it is just something that tells us that there's some information that we need to interrogate in more detail. But I think research is something that it'll be ongoing, and we'll have different perspectives on the same issue and never have the same answer to the same question from different angles that we look at. So over to you, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much. Jean-Louis.
Yes, okay. 3-4 comments. There is never a final word on migration. First, there is a wealth of knowledge. I've been impressed over all these years, the last 20, 25 years, about, the significant, the spectacular increase of literature dedicated, scientific literature dedicated to migration in the different facets of migration. So there is already a wealth of knowledge together. The problem, and I think that you hinted at that, Linda, is that this accumulated knowledge does not permeate, does not translate into the decision-making process, the political decision-making process. Let me take an example. There are dozens of reports highlighting the benefit for receiving country of regular economic migration. There is not one single study, solid study, scientific study, documented study, which had come to opposite conclusion. Did that influence, if I take again the case of the EU member states, did that influence a more positive, a more proactive, a more open narrative with regard to regular economic migration? Did that instill such a narrative in most of the EU member states? No. Simply no. But the evidence is there, but it does not permeate the decision-making process. And indeed, it has a lot to do, and it can influence funding and funding of research. Of course, maybe governments at the end of the day will fund, or public instances, public bodies will direct funding to topics or subjects that they would like to be documented more than the one that would be deemed to be useless, because that would simply not be taken into account in the decision-making process. Now, Irian asked a very, very fundamental question, a question that I'm still asking myself after all these years is, does that mean something to pretend that we can manage migration? Can we manage migration? Where does that kind of splendid ambition come from? I wonder if at the end of the day, the answer is not to be found in a very down-to-earth basic statement. The world is divided in states. Political entities, sovereign states, divided and opposed by border, and which are sovereign within borders. And when you migrate for all kinds of reasons, for protection reasons, for economic reasons, at the end you cross a border, and you have to deal with the different states. I think that this is, for me, one of the fundamental reasons why we cannot escape a debate about managing migration. If we were in a completely entire borderless world, I mean, kind of this big cosmopolitan globalized universe, then migration would not be an issue at all. But migration is an issue because we have to live with states, and therefore we have to, in a way, organize a dialogue, a conversation between states about migration, either at the global level, the global compact, at regional level, what the EU is bravely trying to do, or at sub-regional level. But this is, I think, unescapable. And then you call that dialogue management. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to make any attempt to wrap this up. I think it's very important to discuss these issues. We've addressed a number of things, both at a very high international level and at the ground level, that play an important role in all sort of decisions to migrate, and also in the attempts to interfere in that process. I want to wrap it up. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers. So Jean-Louis, Linda, and Irian for sharing with us their thoughts. I also would like to thank Lauren Landau for co-organizing this, and also Abdelatif Bouaza, the director of IMEA, for his involvement. We started in a bit of a clumsy way, but eventually we managed to get a very interesting, at least in my view, very interesting exchange of ideas. Finally, I would like to invite you for another webinar that Metropolis will organize in a few weeks about the refugee situation in Lebanon. So if you could just stay a few moments, I will share the screen and I will show the details. But that being said, thank you so much. And I wish you a wonderful evening, a wonderful night, a wonderful day, wherever you are. And see you next time.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sharing is not working. I don't know what's a bit wrong.
What happened today?
No. Hey, thank you, Abdelatif.